In this episode, we consider the extent to which the framework of the United States government is falling and what is driving it off the cliff. Hello, welcome to the Call Like I See It podcast. I'm James Keys, and joining me today is a man who has been called by many a smooth operator, Tunde Ogunlana. Tunde, are you ready to show him how you make it happen from the north all the way down to Key Largo?
Yeah, I got no response, bro, because that's one thing I've never been called. So you just put a smile on my face. That's great.
So you appreciate it.
Hey, man, that's the one thing no one's ever accused me of, being smooth. So I just
right,
keep talking. I'm gonna date myself because I keep thinking of Big Daddy Kane's song.
There you go. When you're 6'4", 6'5", you don't need to be smooth. You know, like
hey,
I got it covered other ways.
Because it's cool because like the Big Daddy Kane was like that cool, you know, dark skin, deep voice, chocolate brother. So it's like now you put me in his light. So I feel cool, man.
Feeling good, man.
Now I feel old too.
Man. Let's get it rolling.
Yeah, now I feel old. I'm talking about Big Daddy Kane, but this may be the example of why I'm not smooth. You see what happens?
Yes.
Just try. So let's go. Let's do a show. Let's see how that goes.
Before we get started, if you enjoy the show, I ask that you subscribe and like the show on YouTube or your podcast app. Doing so really helps the show out. We're recording on April 22nd, 2025. And Tunde, over the last few months, we've seen a pretty clear trend in the U.S. government. The president and the executive branch of the government, it writes laws and rewrites laws by decree, aka executive orders. It tells private businesses who they can and can't hire and how they operate, and pretty much does whatever it wants to, including summarily disappearing people into foreign gulags, regardless of what the courts have said and so forth. Now, all this is a sharp departure, not only from the idea of limited government, but also the constitutional principles, things that, are laid out pretty clearly, like separation of powers and checks and balances. And a lot of this would seem to indicate that the constitutional system that we have in place in the United States has failed. Now, one matter that seems to really caught the public's attention is the case where the government disappeared Kilmar Albrego Garcia, a Maryland man, and he's gone. They sent him to a foreign prison summarily. And this is done despite existing court orders saying he was not to be removed from the country. And also then failing to bring him back, despite court orders calling for him to be brought back. And while this looks, of course, to be a terrible abuse of power and just a human rights issue, even if you set aside the fact that the government has admitted that it was an error, the administrative error for this to happen to Garcia in the first place, this is really just one of countless instances where the executive branch is really just kind of stepping on the Constitution. So, Tunde, I want to get us started and ask this question to you. With the Trump administration openly disregarding court orders, including orders from the Supreme Court, and seemingly flaunting while it's doing so, are we looking at a situation where the American constitutional system is failing and like where we're seeing an attempt to establish something else?
I think the answer is yes. So let me say that straight up.
Okay. Please explain.
So I'm trying to think, is it something else? I don't know, right? It could turn into something else.
Well, yeah, I mean, we don't know but the question being like, is something else being established here? Or is everything creating precedent for something else, a new way to operate?
Time will tell on that.
Yeah.
But, and let's see, like you said about the public, right? I mean, we are here 2 days after the 90th 90-day anniversary of this new administration since the inauguration. And you're right. To me, there's two topics that the public seems to have woken up about specifically, at least a critical mass enough that we're having this conversation. One is, like you said, the issue of due process as relates to the Fourth Amendment, which I know we'll get into that story a little bit. But then the other to me is the issue with the tariffs and kind of the economic stuff, which people are feeling because of the stock market and all that. And that also, again, this idea that one man can just make all these unilateral decisions about a $27 trillion economy and global relationships and all that kind of stuff. And so I think that both events happening after other events that we've seen that some could define as a bit chaotic, let's say, it's woken the public up enough, I think, at this point to just start looking in and looking under the hood more so and saying, okay, what's really going on here? And so from something you said in opening up, though, I think there's something important that we've learned over the last decade as our society, that there's laws and rules, but there's also something else, kind of like the dark matter in the universe. It's kind of nebulous and hard to explain, but it's there. And it's just like dark matter. It's kind of the glue that holds the other stuff together, which is just culture, norms, and kind of the spirit of, let's put it this way, in the United States, the spirit of the Constitution, this idea of co-equal branches of government.
Well, see, but that's not the spirit of the Constitution. The Constitution actually sets that up.
Yeah.
That's the text.
Well, I should say this, maybe the spirit. So good point. The spirit of leadership we've had in the past, because you make a good point about the courts have said something. It's one thing. It's not that an administration has never pushed back against a court. Of course, administrations since George Washington have appealed things and all that. But it's the idea that this is the first administration that appears to not care. That's, to me, the big difference, that it's proudly saying we are above the law. And there was even an executive order, if you remember, I think in February, we discussed it privately, where the president made an executive order that states that the executive branch, in conjunction with the attorney general, can decide how to dictate United States law. So basically what they're saying is, me as the executive, I decide when I can or cannot be held under U.S. law. And so, this is an attempt, I think, really to change the fundamental nature of the United States. If you look at it from that sense of from co-equal branches of government to a situation where, I'll just finish this, for a situation where the executive branch is now paramount over the other two branches.
Yeah, it doesn't seem to be co-equal. I mean, and that's the Constitution sets up, you have legislative branch, the executive branch, and the judicial branch. And those are supposed to be co-equal branches, and they each have checks and balances on one another. And I think going down the point you were making, in terms of kind of the culture that evolved around the Constitution as well, I think it's not necessarily the paperwork, the document written on the paper that has quote unquote failed. What's failed is the people upholding it. All these people, all these government officials take an oath to defend the Constitution. And apparently they just didn't mean it. They had other reasons for trying to get in and get all this power that's granted to them by the Constitution, government of limited power. The government only has the power that's given to it in the Constitution in the first place. It's a new theory of government, basically, of the golden rule, kind of who holds the power, who holds the gold holds the power or whatever. But it's like, well, we got the power now and we're going to wield it and make somebody try to stop us, as opposed to this kind of mindset of the power has been granted to us by the people, and therefore we will do the things that are specifically said. I mean, I'm not going to go all legalese on you, but the Constitution says what we can do and what we can't do and so forth. And so the people are failing the Constitution. We have people who are not interested in upholding the Constitution, who are in power. And this is not just in the executive branch, because none of this happens without the blessing of the other branches of government, so to speak, at least to some degree, because we can look back a couple of years ago where the Supreme Court grants the executive branch immunity from the prosecution under the law. So essentially places the Supreme Court, they decided to place the executive branch out of the reach of criminal law, which is not supposed to be the case. All Americans are supposed to be subject to the law. And then you have a legislative branch. They are able to check the executive too through something called impeachment. But if the legislative branch isn't interested, won't look at abuses of power as the executive, crimes against the Constitution by the executive, and say, hey, you got to go, we're going to impeach you, or at least threaten that, then the seizure of power by the executive can happen and everybody just sits around and looks. And so I think it really, though, the focus has to be on the people that are in charge, which were voted in, in many respects. So that go back to the American people. This didn't just happen to us, but the American people had other priorities, essentially, that did not involve putting people in place that would understand we have a government of limited power. And then I say limited power again, because it's like, hey, we want to start telling you how you need to hire people, and all this other stuff. We got government doing that now. And but the priorities of people were on other stuff, basically, as opposed to putting in stewards who would uphold the constitutional system. So yes, the system's failing because it seems like a substantial number of Americans don't care about the system anymore. They're out on the system. That's not a priority for them. And other stuff is. And so therefore that's where we are now.
Yeah. No, and I got, a direct follow up to this because it's interesting in my notes. I was thinking about the same thing, James, because I was thinking, what has happened here in this recent, let's say this recent generation? And I think that, we give a lot of attention, rightfully so, to the actors right now, the people at the top of leadership, the current president and all that. But you make a great point because in the end, they are a symptom, not a cause. They are the manifestation and the result of what you just laid out, which is the American people have checked out partially.
Well, again, we're talking about a subset of people.
Well, enough. So
enough.
And so that's why it's a good road to go down, because what we're learning watching all this is that again, whether it's a democracy or whether it's the cute way that some people say, well, it's a constitutional republic, which it is. In the end, it's a representative government, right? We have a House of Representatives, people that elect people to go to DC, represent their interests, so on and so forth. So the idea is that to make this work the way that the founders, thought of it, right, is that the people need to be able to be engaged and participate.
Yeah.
So there's several things that have happened over the last, basically our whole lives, let's say the last 40, 50 years. One is hyperpartisanship has really gone off the rails. Two, things like starting, I would say the spirit of the Constitution. For example, there's 4.5 former felons in the United States that aren't allowed to vote. There's nothing in the Constitution that says that if you're a criminal, you can't vote. And the idea is that if you served your time in prison, you're still a citizen of the United States. So that's been a decision to try and manipulate who's participating in elections and not. And I can just give that one example.
It's jarring because you got a felon who is getting voted for.
Correct. So that's a whole nother, Dave, that's another show we could do. So let's definitely show that one.
But just hearing it was just like,
I know that's wild. That's the surreal reality we're in right now, right? But my point is though, so if we take that and we multiply that out by, gerrymandering, other ways that the ability for the mass of the electorate to participate has been manipulated, you may have as many as tens of millions of people in a country with 330, 350 million people that have been prevented from participating over the last few decades. That's an example. The second example you give is some of the actors along the way.
Hold on. Yeah. To tie that to your point, though, that's all happened in the open and enough people have indicated they're okay with that or that they support that.
Exactly.
Again, this stuff didn't happen in some smoke-filled room. This happened in the open and people said, hey, I endorse that. I want more of that. Some people, said that. So, of course, you move away from a system in that sense.
That's a great point because it leads me to be able to say this, which this show isn't about this, but I'm going to say it because this is where it gets very sensitive in our culture historically. At the end of the day, you're right, James. This country has only been a full democracy or representative government since 1965 and since then. So this country has been okay with, in the open, disenfranchising a large section of its population since its founding. And again, this is one thing that we don't discuss. This is not the direct topic of this show, but remember, during the founding of this country, people like you and I of African descent were considered property. And legally. So part of the journey as a culture that we've had is figuring out some of this stuff from the beginning of the country, but with a certain energy of our population, our fellow citizens, that just don't want to discuss this at all.
Well,
so it leads to this kind of, I just want to hand this to you, leads to this partisanship about what the truth of the nation is. And I think we've been that steers some people in certain directions versus others. And I think
the
people have been manipulated.
Was what I wanted to get back to, because I know that you had mentioned it, but you kind of went in a different direction. But because I think that I've been asking you for a while, can you hold a system like ours together government with the consent of the governed and on all that stuff. And this rule of law, you got a document that is everything's supposed to be centered around, not a person. Documents don't have charisma, things like that. Can you hold something like that together if one side wants out? And the reason I ask that is because I remember, just the lesson we had, like in the 90s when the U.S. comes in and Kuwait gets invaded, and then we go in and then we take out. Ultimately, we end up taking out Iraq's leadership, and we're like, hey, we're going to give you guys a democracy. Here you go. You can have this democratic system, this great democratic system. And the question is, well, can you give that to people, or do they have to demand it? Because if they don't demand it, then as soon as you try to give it to them, then the people who want to oppress, or the people who want it more, are just going to take over anyway. And if the people don't then fight back against that at all times, stay vigilant to say, no, you're not going to take my liberty. No, you're not going to take my representation. No, you're not going to take that person's representation either, because we're all going to be doing this. Can that system even hold? And so, like, you look back in the 1860s and, part of the country wanted out. They didn't want to do the constitutional system anymore as it was set in place. They didn't want to do, all men are created equal, or, whatever you want to say, which wasn't even lived up to at that point. And it was held together by violence, like in the 1860s. It was absent a war, conceivably, one side would have split already at that point. And then also, if you look at like the Jim Crow time in the United States, where one side said, hey, the stuff that's here in this Constitution, we're just not going to do that stuff. We're not going to do that stuff. We'll do some other stuff. We'll still do a lot of it, but we're not going to do all of it. And so there's always been a tension on how much of the document, so to speak, people are going to buy into. And what I see now is, and this is where it really gets kind of technical, because we've had levels of partisanship and we've had levels of, two parties. We've had two parties pretty much the whole time. The way our system is set up with winner take all elections, kind of forces a two-party system. You have to kind of form coalitions before the vote because you want to get the 51%. And so ultimately, your best chance of getting the 51% is to join up with a bunch of groups beforehand. And then the other side joins up with a bunch of groups. And so it coalesces in that way. But what we've seen, I think, more significantly is that historically, we've had different political parties that have been more diverse in their views. But what we've seen right now is that one party, the partisanship lines tend to be along things that are about kind of what the country's, or is the country going to be about the Constitution anymore? It's like, well, no, we'd rather, one party might say, hey, we'd rather just have a country built around this one person and whatever they say, and so we'll do a presidential campaign and say, hey, we don't have a platform. Our platform is just whatever this guy says. And so our partisanship lines now aren't over issues that are like, oh, okay, yeah, but the economy, how high should taxes be? How low should taxes be? Things like that. It's like, okay, should we have a system where Congress is a check on the executive, where the executive has to follow the law? And so our partisanship issues are issues that are fundamental to the Constitution now. And so we're fighting over those things. And that's why I think it's important that we acknowledge that. Like, hey, we're not all saying that let's operate under this construct of this same Constitution. Some of us are saying let's operate under the construct of the Constitution, which is slow and boring sometimes. And others are saying, look, let's find somebody we really like and then just do whatever they say. And that's kind of that's one of the parties. And it's like, okay, well, that's not the American system anymore, because that is not separation of powers. That's not checks and balances. That's none of that stuff.
Well, I think that's why this moment now maybe is just hitting people, because, I went in preparation for today and I looked up the Fourth Amendment because I wanted to really just see, okay, what does it say versus what has happened to this guy? I believe his name's Abreu, like you said, the one who's been taking the famous case. Apparently, though, let's just say this for the sake of saying it. Apparently, he's one of 240 people that have been taken to this concentration camp in El Salvador. And I say concentration camp because apparently 80% of them have no criminal records here in the United States. So they're not necessarily prisoners. They were kidnapped and taken. Yeah,
they're not being deported either. We should
exactly.
Like, it's like, hold on, they're not just getting set off and here you go, man.
Yeah. So
it's like, no, we're locking you up and throwing away the key.
No, and so here's the thing. I'll just read it. The right of the people to be secure in their persons, houses, papers, and effects against unreasonable searches and seizures shall not be violated, and no warrant shall issue but upon probable cause, supported by oath and affirmation, and particularly describing the place to be searched and the persons or things to be seized. So the government of the United States has admitted, that's the other thing too, that these people are so incompetent, because I just think real authoritarian regimes just wouldn't admit that they screwed up. So these guys have admitted that this guy did nothing wrong, that they basically kidnapped him by mistake. And so then they played a cute game that, well, we can't get him back after the court tells us because the president of El Salvador doesn't want to. But I just read the Fourth
Fourth Amendment.
Silly,
though, because
I know
he's a contractor of ours, of them.
That's why I'm not even
him to lock people up.
That's my point, is saying it's a waste. It's incompetence. Let's put it that way. And it's sad.
It's not. It's just a lie. It's like,
well, it's just silly. It makes it unserious, the position they're in, meaning that it makes our government look unserious, because I just read you the Fourth Amendment of the United States Constitution. They violated that, like many things have been violated.
You're missing the point, though. It's not silly. Yeah. It's not incompetent. It is it's saying, what are you going to do about it? It is a strong arm. They're saying,
it's a challenge.
We know you said this.
System.
Who's going to make us do it? Nobody. So it's not happening. That's why they had the guy up in the White House yucking it up, because it's the point is to flaunt to dangle it in the Supreme Court's face. You're not a co-equal branch with us. It's us. And then you guys can do your stuff over there, but we're superior to that. You're subordinate to us. And so it is, like I said, it's a direct attack on the constitutional system. And they're doing it because they know that Congress won't hold them accountable. Congress has the tools to end that. Like, oh, you're going to do that? You're done. Congress has the tools to do that, but they won't do it because Congress, the leadership in Congress, wants to have a government where this guy leads everything, or the executive branch leads everything, and they just sit on the sideline. That's what Congress. That's what the leadership.
No, you're right, and I think that's where, as you're talking, it just makes me again more and more realize that because it's a democracy or representative government, however one wants to define it, in order to change this, the only way is that more of the population needs to just wake up and participate.
No, for sure. Because the point is,
you're right.
The point is that we have a people problem. We have a people problem. We've elected people to Congress who don't believe in enforcing the Constitution. And it's like, well, hold up. You guys kind of got to believe that. You take that oath. But if you don't believe in enforcing the Constitution, then Constitution is not going to get enforced. Again, you can't just give people rights and liberty. People have to demand them and fight for them, not just for themselves, but for everybody else. And so, we're really in this situation. And I think the partisanship, I wanted to get more on that because that explains it, so to speak. Like the way that Donald Trump was able to take over the Republican Party completely, remake it the party of him. And so therefore the path to power in that party is through him and through his good graces. That kind of revealed a weakness in the system. If he can take over that party, which is much easier than taking over a government, so to speak, if he can take over that party and then have that party have wins on an election, then the people who would be in place normally to serve as a check on his power in the legislative branch, they'll all feel like they're under him. So the partisanship in itself, and then so therefore the reason to follow what he is saying and doing becomes just an issue of partisanship. And I know you've brought it up to me several times, as far as the George Washington's farewell address, and he specifically talked about how partisanship could be and would be a threat to the system because it changes people's loyalties. And this, I want to kick it back to you, but because what you actually see here, and we've seen this play out over years, actually, we've seen this even going back to, again, public statements by officials going back to Obama, when they're saying, hey, we would rather the country fail while he's the president than have him succeed and the country succeed. And it's like, whoa, what are we doing here? Once partisanship becomes stronger than loyalty to the country, then we're on this road where it's a road where there's a cliff and we're heading there and we're not going to be able to maintain our system anymore. Because if maintaining and servicing the party is more important to people than maintaining and servicing the country, then you can't keep the country, because both sides have to be in on at least the Constitution.
Yeah, no, it's interesting because I have George Washington's farewell address here, but it's long enough that I won't read it. But I really recommend that the audience, the audience check it out, because here's the thing, and it's a great point you make, Jane, because when you read it, you realize, number one, it's George Washington, so there's a certain reverence we all have, the first president.
We can't take that for granted anymore. Again, we thought everybody was in on the Constitution too, didn't we?
Yeah. No, it was all a lie, right?
We did a show on that book.
Yeah. No, but what I'm saying is it's now I understand it. Maybe I didn't when I was in school learning this stuff for the first time. he spent so much time in his farewell address addressing this issue and this concern of partisanship and the excitement of passions of men, and to watch out for a demagogue, and that there will always be men in a society that want to excite the passions of others, and basically he basically calls out the tactic of divide and conquer, and partisanships, biases, all that. And it's very
just real quick. I'm gonna let you finish, but the thing that really stands out about that is, remember, at the time, there were plenty of people in the country that were like, "Hey, man, you just be our guy. You just be the leader.
You be our king.
We don't need you to leave. You just stay here and govern us forever." And he was like, "No, that's not what we're doing here." And so then he leaves a warning like, "Hey, this is a constant threat because of our human nature."
Yeah, and so even on top of that, which is interesting, is so the history goes that all the European countries and monarchs thought that they were being like the United States was trying to do some psyop game.
Yeah.
When George Washington stepped down.
Why is he stepping down?
And they had like an election, and Thomas Jefferson became president through a peaceful transfer of power.
Well,
like
Adams
the Europeans,
and then Jefferson,
Sorry, the Europeans never imagined that a leader of a nation would actually just step down and hand over to the next leader. And so that's something that, again, maybe this is necessary for the people to see, to appreciate. This is what, other words can be called a self-corrective mechanism within a society, within a democracy, the ability to turn over the leadership every 4 to 8 years. So you're not stuck with a President Xi or a President Putin. I mean, think about this, James. I've thought about this, just thinking about it. What if George W. Bush was still president of the United States right now in 2025? And he was 25 years our leader. I bet you even people that loved him back then would be tired of him now. Just because it's too long, like the ability to refresh that tree of leadership in the United States system has been a benefit. And again, that was challenged in 2020. Hyperpartisanship was one of the reasons why a large enough portion of Americans were able to be maintained in that false reality.
Well,
right?
we know it was partisanship too, remember, because in the beginning, it was the vast majority of Americans accepted the election. And it was only after being told these messages and then being sold this partisan solidarity, that eventually more people in the Republican Party began to believe the big lie. But initially, Fox, everybody was out there saying, "Oh yeah."
So here's the thing, James, and that's what I want to get to, and I want to get your input on this too, because there's something called the unitary executive theory, right? I mean, we've talked about this, that came out after the Watergate era, when a certain, slice of, I guess, people in elite circles decided we want to be able to have an environment where if a president really were found to be doing something wrong, that enough of the public would be kind of disturbed by that information, not the fact that the Constitution or the norms or whatever was violated, that maybe that president would be able to maintain his power, even though he's been found to do something really egregious. And so that started a lot of things that we've discussed in various shows people can go look at, from the think tanks and all that. But long story short,
that was, to me, I mean, I'm not going to get into that, but that was kind of trying to come up with a justification. You already knew what you wanted to do. These are people who were unhappy with the way that Nixon, once he got found committed a crime, got moved out of office. They were unhappy about that. They did not think the Republican Party should have went along with the idea that, hey, man, you did the crime, we're going to move on.
Yeah, and if you resign,
they thought the Republican Party should have stayed behind Nixon, and therefore he could have survived it if partisanship was higher. And so they set out on a course. Roger Ailes is one of these people. They set out on a course to try to create a situation where partisanship was high enough that no matter what happened in their party, that public pressure wouldn't come from in the party, that they would have partisanship high enough. They set out to make it so that partisanship exceeded country loyalty. And I think we see that they've succeeded with that. Ailes being, one of the people who built Fox News, so
that's why I wanted to bring it up, because it's like this modern era of our politics is where we've seen this. Like, it's like there was a decision
we've
made.
Seen the fruits of this.
Yeah, exactly. That's why I say that this current leadership we have in our current administration is really a symptom of all this, not a cause that America suddenly went off the rails.
Well, it's a symptom, but see what it is though. Also, is that they've decided to push it to the limit. Like let's test this new power. We've had this this alternative approach bubbling up inside. Let's test it out. Let's see how strong it really is. And like that. So we're seeing now the testing out process, and so this is going to get worse. This is going to continue down this path unless and until there's some kind of self-correction.
James, I'm very resigned to the reality that the only way we get back to an America you grew up and I grew up in, and I know that sounds probably to a lot of people listening a little bit hyperbolic. What I mean, though, is we have just explained here in this discussion that the United States is different, is not three co-equal branches of government. The Supreme Court last year gave the executive branch an elevated status above the law. In many cases. So,
and then the Congress that is more partisan than, well, at least the leadership in Congress that's more partisan refuses to put on the table the idea that the president can be held accountable for impeachment. I mean, and the thing really is that it's because the partisanship has created this situation where people feel good about being an American, either because of their party gives them pride, not as because they're an American, not because of the Constitution, because of their party or because of their race or because of their religion. There's all these other things that the party has told them to put primary in terms of their feel good for the country. And even now we're even saying, hey, feel good about the country because of this guy, here, buy this gold coin with his face on it and you can walk around where it's all these things to feel good about besides the Constitution, besides the fact that what makes America exceptional. You actually said a big part of that at the very beginning, or, when you were speaking before about how the idea that America is it's an exceptional nation because it's an exception. The European leaders, when George Washington steps down and John Adams takes over and there's a peaceful transition of power, they couldn't believe it. And then when Thomas Jefferson takes over after John, they couldn't believe it. That was an exception to the way that power is transferred in the world. That's the kind of stuff that makes America an exceptional nation. But people aren't sold that. At least people in the current GOP party aren't sold that that's what makes America exceptional. They're sold all these other reasons that make America exceptional, and up and into and including the dear leader, that they're like, yeah, that's what makes us great is we got this guy. Or, hey, we got this religion. We got all these things that other than the country. And so when their feel good is tied up in that, then that's the stuff that they have loyalty to. And then you end up in a situation where the party will not enforce the Constitution. The party, the people who took the oath of office saying that they will protect and defend the Constitution, weren't telling the truth. They will protect and defend their party. And that's it. And so, yes, the system's failing, but it's not about the system that makes it fail. It's about the people that makes it fail and the people that are in place right now. And so the remedy to that is people as well. And so we'll just see to the extent to which things have to happen, if there's any fight left in the people, because you can't be given liberty. You have to fight for it. So we'll see what fight is left amongst the general American public at this point. And we'll see. So
it's going to be painful, bro. But I just want to finish on this too
we got to close this up though, man.
No, but I just want to finish on the point you just made that it is about the people. I mean, at the end of the day, everyone needs to pay attention, which is why it's probably going to get more painful before the critical mass we need begins to pay attention. So we'll see how it plays out.
Yeah. So, but no, I think we can close this up from there. We'll have part 2 of this topic or part 2 of this show as well. So check that out and we'll talk soon.